says it's recording. I have to record this one on my personal computer. So Alex Thompson is our speaker for this late morning's presentation. Alex is a landscape designer who's been involved with gardens in one form or another since growing up surrounded by nature in the English countryside. She graduated from the College of Professional Studies at George Washington University with an MPS in landscape design. Alex believes that landscape design is a unique space where art meets science. Her approach to design reflects this, with an emphasis on clean lines and creating spaces that give plants new outside rooms to love. Her passion is making sure that nature is also at home, using native plants to create beautiful, biodiverse, and ecologically functional gardens. She worked with Alyssa Mira, and she's one of the landscape designers with them. So let's all welcome Alex, who will now share her screen.
I am going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so thank you so much for having us both here today. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about concepts and principles behind design. So if you heard the first part of our presentation, Elisa talked about the importance of site analysis and really understanding what's going on site. So this is kind of the second part, like what do we do with all that information next and how do we put it together? At NPLD, we do specialize in sustainable landscape design, and we have a heavy emphasis on using native plants. Although the concepts we're going to talk about today for design are universal, the thing that makes us a little different to like more conventional practitioners is that we're also trying to put some ecological functionality into our designs, landscapes, because we want them to work for what our clients want and also for nature. So we really want to think of people as not being separate from nature, but being fundamentally part of it. We're all part of one thing. We learned a lot from Alonso this morning about how interconnected all of the elements are of natural landscapes, all the way down to fungal interactions with plant roots. So now we're going to think about how we could use design to achieve some of the same benefits, because in theory we could answer everything that the client wanted to have, but if we just went down as a checkbox, we could end up with something that was a terrible space and had no ecological functionality if we didn't really think about it. So one of the things I'd like you to think about is the fact that design is a universal thing. We really see it everywhere. So all of these things are designed things. They're not landscapes, but these were all created to make functional solutions to solve an existing problem. So some of them are more glamorous, like maybe a Tesla, we need an electric vehicle. And then on the top right, we've got like the ballpoint pen. Like somebody had to think about what the problems were that they were addressing to do all of these things. And some of them are like pretty iconic, like the Coke bottle. Everyone would recognize that. So all of these objects were designed to solve specific problems. So bear that in mind. So then we could move forward and look at some pretty iconic landscapes here. So we've got this on the top left, we've got this bucolic Palladian bridge, which is in Stourport, the big parkland there in England. So that's 18th century. Through the middle, we're looking at mid-century modern Falling Water, Pennsylvania, a little bit closer to home here for us. And then to the top right, we've got the 9/11 Memorial in Manhattan. So these are all spaces that were created. One of them is residential, or was originally. Two of them are public spaces now. Top left one was originally residential also, so very different scales. But they were all made to serve a purpose. And on the top left, we're looking at a very naturalistic landscape. Nothing naturalistic about the 9/11 Memorial at all. And in the middle, we've got like a we've got a very angular, modern looking building, but it's set in a very parkland, naturalistic woodland. So all of these are elements, and none of this is an accident. All of this was done with very specific design intentions. So another thing for us to think about is how ancient landscape design is. People have been manipulating landscapes for millennia by making spiritual structures. So think of like Stonehenge, developing land for agriculture, and then sort of maybe more recently, the development of pleasure gardens started. So, for example, we've got gardens that are all the way back in ancient Egypt, so around 4,000 years ago. On the left there is a garden that was actually planted as part of the funerary structure, with like highly symbolic plants that were put in there that were speaking to the afterlife. And in one of my former lives, I used to be an archaeologist, so I'm sort of interested in this too. So the species that were planted there were very specifically done. So we can sometimes see things that we can excavate. On the top right there, we see a contemporary representation of a garden. And this was an individual called Nebamun's estate, also in the area of Thebes, modern Luxor. So that's a little bit more recent, about 700 years more recent than the funerary garden. But we can see what people thought about their landscapes through this evidence. We've got Roman gardens that are still in existence. So maybe some excavation, maybe a bit of restoration, which may or may not be accurate. But we can go and actually experience these. And then even more recently, here's a Renaissance garden, also in Tivoli, in Italy. These are the gardens at Villa d'Este, which are amazing and focused on water. So the interesting thing is that we can look at these old gardens and we can see things that still speak to us. So sometimes we like to borrow stuff from the past to connect ourselves with other cultures, but even in the here and now, we find these to be pleasant places to be, and we want to be in them. And that is also not an accident. They were designed to serve people primarily. In these cases, these were not for your everyday people at the time when they were made, but there's a lot of design that's gone into them. So I want to start to maybe have you be able to unpack some of what's going on in these spaces and think about why they're like this and what about them has made them kind of timeless. Okay, so design really affects our like emotional responses to landscapes. I don't know that people often think about their emotions when they're in places. Sometimes you're not aware of it. Other times you're really aware of this. So this is for both good and bad. There are places where you'll realize if you kind of stop and think, you don't really want to be there and they're kind of uncomfortable and you might need to pass through them, but that's it. And there are other places that make you feel very comfortable. You want to be in them. And that is because of the design intent and the execution of the design of that space. So, for example, here is Freedom Park Plaza in the district, which people might be familiar with, which is beloved by very few people except for skateboarders that are constantly being chased out of there by the park police. But this picture is actually a pretty good one. It's, you know, we're in the spring or the summer, some shadows being cast, but, you know, this is a place you might imagine it's a public space people might want to be in, but no one's there, right? It's very exposed. There's not really a great reason to be there. Like there's not great seating. It just feels not necessarily at a human scale. Another example, we could think of as a design space that also you might look and just be like, oh, I'm not sure about how I feel about being in this place. This is just a rooftop garden across the river from Manhattan, but there's nothing living there. It's very dead as a landscape. And again, it's very exposed. There's no ceiling on it. There's a little bit of a wall from the railings, but it's just not somewhere, certainly for me, that my heart sings out to be. All I can think of is how hot those metal chairs are going to be in the summer, and I'm not going to want to be there. And here is sort of sadly what is like the classic American landscape that we see so much of. This is pretty much a biological desert. Nothing's living here. Could really be anywhere. I just pulled this image off the internet. I don't know where it is, but we might see it here. Could see it in the Midwest. Could be in California. Can't really tell. The plants don't tell us anything about a sense of place here. There's a few shrubs next to the house. We see a lot of lawn, which, like we know now, is a big water hog if you're in a hotter environment, and also like the runoff levels from it are not that much less than is what's coming right off that driveway right there. So all of these are places you don't really want to be. You might go through them because you need to, but they're not your destination. You're not going to seek them out. So then we can think about some places that have the opposite effect on us, and they make you feel comfortable, excited to be there. They're intriguing. This is the Folly at Chanticleer Gardens, just outside of Philadelphia. It's one of my favorite public gardens. It's close to here. So this is not really a ruin. This thing was put there. And inside there's this amazing table with water on it. And you really want to see what is inside that. Above us, we can see in the picture, there's a tree above us. So there's a little bit of a ceiling on top of us. And there's something about this place that is interesting. And I think it's a place that you want to be. Like, what is through that doorway? What is around the corner? I'm in a more urban setting. This is a picture of Paley Park, which is a pocket park in Manhattan. It's kind of famous. This is like a little dead space, but it is very well used. There's a great focal point with the water at the background and the back coming down the wall. The walls on either side have been planted so they don't feel so barren. There's seating there, there's some shade. And it's really considered to be a very successful urban small park. So think of it in contrast to like the Freedom Plaza, which is bigger. It's on a very different scale, but it's so exposed, and this is not. So they've really taken advantage of the fact that they're in this little kind of canyon between buildings. This is a garden in Alexandria that we installed and designed and installed just last year. So the planting has not grown in yet, but this went from sort of an overgrown space to nothing there, to be in kind of a structured spot that you're like, maybe I want to sit on the deck and experience this space. So that was a big difference that happened just by doing some things that were really kind of simple, by putting a strong shape in there, multiple materials to define the space, and then enhancing the privacy by continuing to plant on this bank. And lastly, this is a location that we are going to come back to talk about at the end of this talk. This is another garden that we designed and installed last year, so it's not mature yet. The guys are down the top right-hand side of the picture. They're actually just finishing off a stream that's going down the hill. But there's a destination here. There's a place to sit. There are trees above you. There's a green wall around you. Like, it's a comfortable space. So what is the process that we use to get from some site that we're presented with to having a plan that can actually be executed and put in? Our critical site is a part of this process, which Elisa talked about, is visiting the site and experiencing it. And then, of course, there's talking to the clients and being able to get a distinct list together of what their goals are, what they want. So we've got both our existing conditions that we need to work within that are going to constrain us somewhat. We talked about maybe there are septic fields, maybe there's existing hardscape, overhead wires, maybe the soil is compacted. We'll take all of that into account. And then these are some of kind of the common issues that we hear from clients. I mean, there are many more, as many issues as there are different clients, but these are things that people typically want to do, is to think about stormwater management, which may have led to erosion issues. They would like to often add wildlife provisioning, for example, like birds in the garden. A lot of people are avid bird watchers. They'd like to manage out of balance wildlife, which is, I think, is kind of just polite for deer, really, in our area. So we have that issue in so many places, and we can address it. A lot of people would like to add a seating area, maybe where there isn't one. They want to improve access to their garden, maybe up a slope, adding a pathway, and then just generally adding interest to the landscape. Maybe we do that through using focal points. Maybe it's the planting itself going through the seasons. So that's just kind of a list of things that we're going to try to address, these are going to be our inputs to the design process, which is going to look something like this. So we've got the site analysis and this client program that we've developed with them, and it's going to go into developing a concept design. And this is really an iterative process until we get things where they need to be. So the more we have for these inputs, the closer we'll get quicker. But we want to go back and talk to people, present the design to the client, take the input, revise it, and then come back. And our eventual plan should be a master plan that we can take dimensions off. There are planting plans, and it can go to a contractor and actually go into the ground. So that's how our process works. And really, if you think about any of the other designed objects that we looked at, people are going to be doing the same things. So the design philosophy behind this is kind of an important thing for us to consider. So it's kind of conceptual, but it really underpins everything. One of the designs that's philosophies that we might have heard about before, and it was certainly touched on this morning, is this idea of ecosystem services. So these are things that nature is doing for us, kind of when it's sitting there pristine, it's doing it for us at no cost to us. These are the things that nature is designed to do. And these things actually have a quantifiable financial value, and there are all sorts of calculators, and they're more or less accurate. They're all estimates, but you can actually calculate sort of, for example, what value an acre of highly functional woodland brings. So this helps people guide urban planning decisions, and also for us more at the residential scale. These are things that we want to think about. So for example, we've got provisioning services. So are we providing food? Are we maybe producing biomass that we can use? Maybe that's even in the form of like fiber, it's wood. Are we cleaning water coming out of our sites? And then there are also sort of medicinal purposes to adding food. Some people want to even do medicinal gardens. There are supporting services that are happening all the time. There's nutrient cycling. The water cycle's taking place in all of our gardens. We want to be producing soil, not losing it. And of course, photosynthesis is happening. Our environment's doing regulatory functions for us in terms of managing air quality, regulating the temperature, managing stormwater runoff, reducing erosion, and having pollination services happening. So think all these things are happening kind of silently in the background. And sometimes we see things that tell us that they're happening, but often we're sort of oblivious to this. And lastly, importantly, there are also cultural services that the environment's doing for us, which are really to do with human well-being. The environment is an educational place, it's a spiritual place, and a place for us to have recreation, and that is as important as everything else. So these are the things happening all around us, and so we're interested in maintaining and having our designs support all of these things. So think about that, back to that barren landscape of the house with the lawn and really very few plants. Very few of these things are taking place. That is not a net contributor to any of these processes. So that's one of the reasons we don't want to be designing sites like that anymore. So we look at doing sustainable design. So here are the elements that we can consider to be sustainable design. We've got environmental benefits, so they're just big bins that go in. There are the resources that are required to do the design, do the development and the installation of a design, and also the resources required to maintain it, which is really critical for our design landscapes. And then there are also cultural elements. Like if nobody cares about a landscape, it's not going to get maintained if people are not getting anything out of it. So to some degree or another, knowingly or unknowingly, successful designs will address all three of these elements so that we can get into the sweet spot in the middle where they're all being considered. But we see kind of like maintaining the status quo is probably no longer possible for us. This is a picture that I took in the park that's just around the corner from my house. And we can see that the quicker water inputs that we're getting that are just tearing through here are causing severe erosion. There are a lot of invasive species in this park. So we're losing soil, we're not storing water, it's running right off into the bay with pollution in it. So you can see like all of these like pretty large trees that have been knocked down in there. This didn't used to be like that. This woodland stream shouldn't be 20 feet deep. It should be much shallower than that. So we need to look at something a little bit new. We need this new framework, which we think about as regenerative design. So just really simply put, we've got inputs coming into our landscape system. We want the outputs to be more. So we want to be net positive contributors of clean water, of clean air, of resources for wildlife and for ourselves coming out of our landscape system, which then of course becomes a feedback loop, and these things become the feedback to our system. So just have that in mind of your model when you're thinking about design. It's conceptual, but I think they're useful concepts to have. So there are also sort of physical design principles which apply to lots of different things, to include our landscapes. These are abstract, but we do need them to achieve successful design. So these are concepts like the unity and diversity that we might see in a design. So on one hand, we might be looking for contrast in size, in color, different ways to achieve this. Or we might be looking for something that's very harmonious, that's very similar all the way through. Maybe in color, maybe in form. These are not right or wrong decisions, they're just different tools that we can use. We might be looking for things that are very symmetrical, kind of like the dots on the left, or we could be looking for things that change size, or maybe they repeat in a symmetrical or asymmetric way, as on the right. So we can have design motifs do all of these things, and it will change the experience of the space. So where we see a lot of symmetry, these places will tend to feel more static. When we see asymmetry, when we see curves, maybe things are fading into the distance to enhance a perspective, we see movement in the landscape. So this could be the shape of beds, it could be the plants within them. And then we've also got proportion and scale. We may or may not want one thing to dominate in our landscape because it's bigger than everything else. So we want things to be on a human scale. I think that's one reason that some big plazas don't feel comfortable when they're open. They're just sort of too big for people. There's no reason that you wouldn't want to go sit on like one seat in the middle of an enormous big square thing. You want something around you. It's just not comfortable for people. So sometimes we want something to be really big, sometimes we don't, but always on a human scale. And then we've got the elements of the design that we might use in order to achieve these principles. So this is not an exhaustive list by any matter means, but these are just some things that we might use. So we might think about like the structure of a shape. So we can use things like positive and negative spaces. So our positive spaces are filled with things, the negative spaces are not. So one example of this, I actually really like to use lawn as our negative spaces that's then surrounded by planting beds to give this structure and the contrast from that. We want strong, bold shapes and lines, like weak curves are not our friends, and weak shapes. We want them to be strong and very intentional. So the picture on the right, we can see a lot of intention there with the curves, with the upright rectangular posts that are in there. The benches fit nicely into them, and then they're surrounded. You can see the negative space of the gravel walkway in the middle, surrounded by plantings to make the positive space as well. Even in our planting design, so we're thinking about everything from organizing the space down to organizing planting beds. We want to think about structural elements. So we've got texture is bigger, and actually, in my opinion, this comes even before color as a really important planning device that we have. So I think of all of these as structural plants that we can use. So we've got maybe evergreens and maybe shrubs, maybe they're going into a hedge, maybe they're just punctuating a bed to give that structure. We could use grasses for the same things. We've got the common reed there, the Juncus effusus on the top. Bottom, we've got some Panicum virginicum. It's doing the same thing. And then we've got structural flowering plants like Veronicastrum is a good example, and Echinacea. These are kind of the statement plants. So they're giving us that punctuation texture. And then we could think in contrast of the plants that are maybe more filler. And I always think that sounds like a little bit dismissive. It's not like, it's just filler. These are supposed to be soft textures. So they're very different to the spiky things that we might be encountering. So here we've got prairie dropsy, the Asparabolus heterolepsis on the left. We've got the Coreopsis in the middle, and then Geranium maculatum. They're good examples of filler plants that we might use. And we can also have different textures in the hardscapes that we use. The image on the left is actually a garden that we installed. So we used some boulders to give some texture because they were looking for low maintenance things. And there's nothing more low maintenance than a boulder once it's in. And they're really beautiful, and they give you somewhere to sit as well. Really fun for kids to climb on. So that's a nice way that we can add texture. Maybe it's hardscape. Maybe we're doing some sort of regular flagstone like in the middle. Maybe as on the top right, we're doing steps that may be more organized or less organized, depending on the stone that we choose. So there's all sorts of different ways that we can get this texture in. Color, this is just literally a thought about color theory, and this is a good way for us to achieve either think about that idea of contrast or harmony. So if we wanted to take something that was highly contrasting, we could take something from the warm side and we could plant it right next to something from the cool side. So imagine a cardinal flower that's planted right next to a blue false indigo. That would be like high impact color contrast. Or you could do something that was very harmonious, that was perhaps tones. So maybe you're going to choose like just blues and greens might be something that you might do for a border that was more harmonious for the planting design, or even do tonal inside just one of these sectors. So maybe a border just using yellow plants that perhaps they're flowering to different times of the year. That can be done with enough planning. And then we also, in contrast to designers of other things, we have a hidden element, which is time. So there's two parts to that. There's the example that is illustrated by these pictures. This is a garden that Elisa designed and installed, I think 2 seasons ago now. So we've got the garden maturing through time because we're working with living systems. So things are not going to look the same when you put them in as they are when the garden matures. And then the other component to that is also things are going to change through the year. So we're going to have different colors appearing, different structures appearing, depending on whether we're in the winter. Deciduous trees, if they're chosen as specimens, can be marvelously architectural if they're put in the right place as a statement. Or maybe we're going to use an evergreen device. There's all sorts of different ways to approach it. So none of these things individually is wrong or right. It's about the composition of the whole. So one of the clearest ways to start breaking down landscapes that we're looking at is to think about, well, are they formal? Like, is the organization of the space formally done, or is it informal? So we can see this in a lot of places, and I have not sadly been to all of these places, so the pictures are from the internet. But think of something that's highly formal and structured. There's nothing natural about this. It is geometric. It is about people. This is not designed for anything except for people, and it's very beautiful, highly geometric. These formal landscapes are often designed on an axis. They often have a lot of symmetry to them. The axis is maybe leading out from a building as well. This is very grand and formal, but we might have something that's on a smaller scale as well. Superhuman centered. So this is the Orangery at Versailles, huge scale. Also imagine the Taj Mahal, right? This is another thing. We're leading on axis off the building. It's not a natural place at all, but it's very beautiful, and there's something very pleasing to the symmetry of it. More recently, we've got the Getty Museum. So this is really a pretty formal landscape that's been done with the planting of the hedges in the middle. It's running off an axis of the water that's coming out from the building. There are the hardscape elements that make it pretty formal. This is more recent. This is kind of in the 90s. This was installed and it's still being developed. And then from the 50s, we've got other types of, this was a private residence, the Miller House in Indiana. And this was done by Dan Kiley. So note the focal point at the end of this symmetrical row of honey locusts. It's really beautiful. It's very simple. But again, we're looking at axis and symmetry. We've got places that have got both of these. This is very near to where I used to live in England. And this is a Capability Brown. This is an 18th century landscape. And he designed all of it. So you've got the formal terrace in the front. Again, not really about nature, all about people. Symmetry, perfection of the reflections in the water, statuary, flanked by the terrace. But the parkland behind it, none of that is an accident either. That was all planned to be that way. So all of the view sheds are planned, so on a huge scale. So it looks very natural, like it's just supposed to be that way. It's not. So we do see both of these things can be, they're not mutually exclusive by any stretch. They can all be included together. More recently, this is a beach house in New York that was done in really much more of an informal style. This is an Ohm van Sweden and Associates design that was done. This is a coastal property. So we've got like a meandering pathway done in a local material. The plantings are not all native at all. There are non-native salvias, euphorbia there, and alliums, but they're very beautiful and they're giving a lot of structure, even though this is like a less organized space. This is much more natural feeling. And there are potentially some things like the bayberries in the back that are really starting to do something for nature. This is not just about people. This is a landscape that was done by Larry Weiner and Associates in Pennsylvania. So this is also pretty informal compared to the other ones. Even though we've got the square lines of the ponds, we've got kind of an informal seating area that's more regular. The planting is all natives and it's really pretty loosely done. And then there's of course Pete Udolph. If you want to see his work locally, visit the High Line in New York City. Is kind of one of the famous. He's one of the principal designers of that. So he's kind of a master. This is, funnily enough, using a lot of Native American plants from here, but in the Netherlands where he lives. So he's really the master of also planting for all seasons. And this thought that Alfonso also talked about earlier of leaving dead things to stand over the winter and really finding beauty in that. So we know there are huge ecological benefits, but it's really a different aesthetic. So we're leaving the plants to be used by next year's generation of insects. So that's important. And also they're perhaps resourcing birds by allowing seed heads to stand over the winter. But human beings get enjoyment out of this too. So this is all about texture and color, really the master. So if anybody has ever seen it or wants to visit it, the High Line in New York is a fabulous example. This particular garden in the Netherlands, I also really like because I find there's a great contrast between the plantings, which are loose and there's so much variety and a lot of movement in them. And then these beautiful clipped hedges in the background. So formal and informal are not mutually exclusive, and having elements of both is a really good strategy. So we've got garden planting styles that have come up. So here are a few that might be recognizable. So you can think about what the elements are that make them what they are. So this is also by no means exhaustive. This is just like a quick rundown of maybe 7 different things. So we've got our prairie style gardens. So great, the prairies are not native to this part of the US, but we do see some of the same plants indigenous to here and things in areas along the Potomac River, for example. There are like river prairies here. So yep, totally appropriate, very sunny. We've got these minimalist modern gardens. This is also a Pete Udolph planting too. We've got monocultures of you could do with native plants. There's no reason to not do that. We've got this cottage garden style, which is super pretty, romantic, blousy, kind of, you can't really see the edges of the path. So less informal, but there's a way through it. Not native plantings here at all. In fact, this might even be from the UK, not from the US. But we're allowing things to grow through the pathway. So think about that as a style. Another contrast, similar but a little different, is this kind of English style perennial border where we've got a frame. And this is really useful for when we're using native plants as well. We've got a frame of lawn around it that makes the edge really legible next to the path. So that's another good design piece that you can do that gives really good structure from the lawn. Even though it's a little piece of lawn, it's doing an important job here. We can also see that we've got layering. So we've got horizontal layering coming as everything gets shorter to you as it comes closer to you. So a lot of color, a lot of movement, but it's all constrained in a border. Here we've got a woodland garden. This is maybe even less informal and something that we do a lot of around here. So this is a woodland garden in spring. So this area has just been designed to speak for really this one season. Right before the trees have leafed out, this is the star of all of these woodland perennials coming out. So there's some Virginia bluebell in there, and it's just doing amazingly. And you'll see this in our native areas if you go and poke around in any of the woodlands around here that are more or less functional and haven't been damaged too badly by invasives. You'll see these things. Here's a designed wetland garden. It looks kind of natural, none of it is. And I actually think that Larry Weiner did this one too. So you can see like the Pachyra aurea doing well in the shade. We can see some ostrich fern in the back. We see cinnamon fern. We see some Christmas fern, and it's just doing beautifully. The boulders weren't there. They were put in there to make this scene, to make this be a place that you want to be. And then there's a great idea, which we don't see very much here. This is this thought of the gravel garden. This is Beth Chatto's gravel garden, again in England. But this is a great way that we can have pathways go through that are really permeable. So when we think about managing stormwater, gravel is one of the best surfaces. It's great for people to walk on, and it's really beautiful because you can plant through it as well. So that's another nice thought that we can do. And here you'll also see there's a lot of variety of the texture in here, and there's some color. So we've got the blue at the front, that's kind of the star that's happening at the minute, and then something else will happen and take over the color. But you'll see a lot of the bases are yellows and greens. So we're just relying on the textures of all of these grasses to carry most of the load in this planting. So our planting inspiration comes from how nature arranges herself. So that's one of the ways that we can also achieve getting ecological functionality out of our design systems. They're never going to be quite the same because we're going to have things in maybe a higher density than nature would do. But we want to take some of the same elements. And one of the most important things to take away is this idea of layering. So nature has got both vertical and horizontal layers. So we can think of this as a woodland with all of these different layers in it. So this is really showing vertical layering, and this is just little cartoons. So we'll move really quickly through. There's a canopy layer, there's an understory layer, there's a shrub layer, and there's a perennial and ground cover layer. So if we were looking at a meadow system, we're probably only going to be looking at the perennial ground cover layer, maybe a few shrubs as well to give structure, but a woodland system would have all of these. So that concept of vertical layering and then also horizontal layering, if you think of like the perennial borders where you've got like a school picture, it's like short kids at the front, tall kids at the back. That's very comfortable to us, and it just makes sense to organize the inhabitants of the space in that way, and to make it look very intentional and not really accidental, because that's how we make landscapes that are legible. So now I'm just going to walk you through an example of a landscape that we did and installed also last year in Northern Virginia. And here are some pictures of what it looked like before we started. And I haven't got the most clever pictures from the exact same spot from before and after, but it should give you some good sense that we were working with the area that is above this retaining wall. And there's not a lot going on in the space at the minute. We've got an existing border around the site. There's a fence. There's already, these are actually eastern hemlocks along the back there that were put in there, gosh, probably 40 to 60 years ago. So they've survived the building of the more modern houses in this area. And then there's a lot of beech woodland. The whole of the site is set within like a mixed music hardwoods plant community. A lot of beeches, pretty acidic soil around it. So that's what this was originally before people decided to put plants in here. That the hemlocks were probably a decision that was made ages ago. They are not typically found as low in elevation as this site is, but they're working there. So we can see at the bottom along the driveway, we've got something that's kind of maybe a little bit more typical, just the lining with some box. So we're looking at the space above, which also happens to be a septic field. So note that there's a slope coming down. At the top of that slope, it's pretty flat. And as we go back towards the fence, there's another slope that goes up. So we had to think about stabilizing all of this. So here's looking across the septic field. So you can really see there's not a lot happening here. And the owners were really looking for something with a lot of life, a lot of wildlife provisioning, and something that they would also enjoy, that would have focal points, biodiversity, would take into account the fact that the area is heavily visited by deer. There are some really good resources on how to design, nobody would ever say deer proof, but deer resistant landscapes. And there are ways to do it. They're creatures of habit. So taking note of the direction that they cross to traverse your landscape is really important, because they tend to not diverge from that too much. So we don't plant deer candy along those pathways, for example. So that's another thing that we would take into account with our site analysis step. And there's an author called Karen Chapman, who has an actual book on deer resistant design. You can look at it on Amazon, and it's really pretty good. We can choose species that are not attractive to them. And then, as Elisa mentioned, we can also have things like the deer out be applied. And then here's just sort of looking back up along the side of the drainage fields. You can see it's going into woodland pretty quickly. So that's our adjacent landscape. So we've really got a pretty sharp contrast between where people decided this is going to be lawn from here onwards, which it was originally, but this lawn doesn't really want to be in this place very much. You can see a lot of moss because it's wet because of the septic field. So we took note of all of these things when we did the site analysis and took an inventory. And we're actually going back to this site to do more work that will be more of a restoration planting outside of these designed areas. And Alonso also talked about that briefly earlier. So we've done a survey and seen what already grows there. So we're not going to be adding things that are not already there, unlike what we did in the very design space of the pollinator garden that we're about to look at. we went and we counted 15 species that were already living there, that were perennial species, and we're looking to remove invasives and then control them partly by replanting what wants to be there. So taking out the Japanese Pachysandra, I think that we're going to see the ferns that we see sporadically elsewhere on the bank come back through as soon as they get the opportunity. So an invasives control company has come in to manage that work. So it should be setting the scene for us to go and do a restoration planting in the spring. So that's in contrast to this. So here is what the beginnings of our site analysis looked like. So we can see that we are looking here, we've got the driveway. This is the retaining wall that we were looking up onto. And here's our sloped area. And right on top of that, this is the septic field in gray. So that was a big constraint. We didn't have very good access up the hill from the top of the stairs. So that was something we had to think about. Here, this is 10 feet from the active drain field. Because when we're looking at septic fields, we don't want to be planting certainly woody plants in this area, in this buffer area. Not on the field, not within 10 feet from it. And we really don't want a lot of trees, even in this 10 to 20 foot buffer that you see, which is the really outside line of it. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead. So we're looking to make sure that we're now planting. So that's actually quite helpful. It sort of dictates things. I like to use shrubs as a lot of structure in my designs, but we couldn't do that. So we had to do structure with perennials in the drain field and just around it as well. So that was an interesting challenge. And you can see the beginnings of the woodland around it. So this is different to the area. The area that we'll be doing this spring is like off to the left of this drawing. So here we go. Here is the master plan that we came up with. So here's a thought. Think about that idea of using the lawn for structure in this space. So you'll see all of the green here. That is part of the structural device because we can't do it with any shrubs. So we've got lawn pathways and then a lawn seating area. And we wanted to put these really bold curves in. That was important in this space. So that almost exaggerated curves. So that when you're in the space, you don't look straight through anything. Insipid curves, not our friends. We want everything to almost feel exaggerated when we draw it. And then we continued the circular, we continued the circular motif of the seating plan down here, which is actually a hill. So here we've got another circle, but this has got our focal point going down it, which ended up being a stream. So this got added in later because we tried to be flexible. So we've got a stream going down the hill that's starting up here, so we can hear the sound from the seating area and experience it as a focal point as we come up these steps that we added in, boulder steps, just big stones stacked on top of each other to make steps to come up because we wanted it to feel kind of natural. You're transitioning from the sharp, square built steps into something where you know you're moving into nature. And then we can move down through the lawn pathways here and experience this. And we ended up pulling the planting down into this area as well. Then we've got sedges down here that we can also walk on. So thinking back to that vertical layering thought, we want to be covering the ground with everything. We don't like bare planting where things are not touching and they're miles apart. Everything in this design is drawn in at 80% of what it will become, the maximum size. So we may not ever reach the maximum size. But just to give you some idea, this is not what things look like when they're put in. We're going to be using much smaller plants when they go in. So initially things will not be touching, but the idea is that they will grow into a design community in the end. So let me just look at my list to make sure I haven't missed anything out. Nope, I think I've missed everything. So another thing that I like to do is partly to really bring out the structure for you to see. As you can see in black and white, you can see the lawn structure jumping out maybe a little bit more. So that's really because we couldn't do shrubs. That's like the hook that our design hangs on for this. So we've got some shrubs that we've added back here outside of our drain field area, our critical drain field area, and the existing shrubs, but in the middle we can't have any. So there are other ways to do it. You don't have to rely on planting woody plants to do it. And here is our woody planting plan. So if we think about going through the vertical layers, these are all the woody plants that we're going to put in to start off. So we've got the existing canopy, but there was no understory underneath it. So one of the things that we've done is we've added in an understory of native flowering trees. So we've got red buds, dogwoods, some mountain laurel here to complement the hemlocks that are there, and various other shrubs that start to make a screen and an underplanting to the existing woodland. So we're right along that edge or ecotone, as Elisa mentioned, where we're transitioning from the woodland area into our kind of meadow pollinator area. And we've got some winterberries here, we've got spice bush, we've put in some buckeyes here, we've got some hydrangeas, and as we get closer to the house, we've used some cultivars here of like sweet spire, summer sweet, that sort of thing, to give us color and variety. And then we've got some Ilex glabra here to give us some evergreen structure at the top to be a backdrop to the stream going down. So here we go, we can see that we've probably, even though we've not got extensive shrub planting here, we've got probably 15 different kinds of shrubs in here, to include the cultivars that we've used, which we take great care to not use cultivars that are ecologically damaging, in terms of ones that we know that they've been altered so much by breeding that they're no longer useful to wildlife at all. And we know that all of these are still useful. They're not functioning exactly the same way as the species, but we know that they are contributors to the wild, to the ecosystem. And also just to note that to help us do the planting on this, we put a 5-foot grid on the drawing and we actually drew it out on the ground. So that will give you some idea of how big the space is. That's helpful. So we flagged it and we literally painted it on the ground so that we could plant through it, because otherwise in these big areas, it's almost impossible. And here's what's happening for shrubs, for the perennial layer. So we've got much more biodiversity here. We're probably looking at close to 40 species in here. So that's partly to give us that year-round color. And when I say color, I really think of it as an analog for the resources that we're giving to wildlife through the year. So we want it to be happening from very early in the year to all the way to the end of the year with our asters and solidagos after everything else has stopped flowering. And of course, through the summer months, there are also things that are here that are giving food and shelter. So that's kind of a critical thing, is from an ecological perspective, if you've got a lot of variety, you're servicing things through the year, because we don't want something to just turn into a desert come the 1st of September and it's not useful anymore. So we've got a lot of sedge planting that's underplanting everything. One of the concepts that we try to mimic is this idea of green mulch, rather than having people throw out wood mulch every year, which is not sustainable, and it's also a pain. So we want to be able to get away from that by underplanting everything with sedges, which is what we see happening in woodlands around here, all south. So they're great for holding the ground together and also for helping to manage runoff and increase percolation in these areas that are already planted. So we've got the sedges all around the area outside here. We've got some foxtail sedge, which is bigger along the top of the retaining wall. And then here we did Carex amphibola, which is an evergreen or semi-evergreen sedge, and that's right along the top of the retaining wall, partly to give access, because people are going to need to walk there at some point. And we wanted it to be lower as well, so this will only get to be 12 inches tall. So because we had to do structure with perennials here, not woodies, we've got really tall perennials. We've got species Joe Pye weed in the middle. That might be something you might not usually use, but good for this wetter environment. And it's really giving structure, and it will stand through the winter. We've got some Veronicastrum is in there also to give structure. We put some Vernonia novaborensis. We've got New York ironweed in there, also really tall plants. So the idea is that they will stand through the winter. So even when this landscape is now and it's quiet, there'll still be some islands of planting that will be taller. And we recommend that all of this stays through the winter, as we were talking about earlier with the capital naturalist. And we have movement from grasses down the edges. And then around here, we're thinking a little bit more like, oh, there's going to be a fake stream. There was never a stream before. It's a great wildlife resource, but we've got some more water-loving things even coming down this hill. And then this is just kind of to show like other things that we might do with design that may not be interesting to clients, but it's essential for installation contractors. And it may be interesting for you to think about how you take measurements when you're doing design. So you need to choose this POB, there's a point of beginning that's a fixed site on your overall site. So here, I picked this top of the column here, the top of the railing. Great, it's not moving anywhere. And we start measuring from that to lay our lines out. So then we can measure our curbs in at maybe 3-foot intervals. And that then gives us this pathway. And then we know that this is going to start here, this distance along this line, go to the middle. The radius of this is about 15 feet in diameter. So we know we're around 7.5 feet in here to get to the radius to go all the way around to then draw that in, because then this had to be turfed afterwards. And it just lets us keep track of where we are on site. So that's another kind of important thing when you think about proportion and how we're going to organize our site. So here's what we look like after we were done. So this is the drain field, as was before, was just sort of the failing lawn that wasn't really doing anything. The plants are little because they've only just gone in, but here's our seating area. And we're looking down on the driveway. And interestingly, like all the plants sat down on here on the driveway. One part of design is thinking about how we're actually going to install it. And where do you put your plants before they go in the ground? Like if you've got a lot of them, you need an area. So they went down on the driveway and we hauled them all up and put them in, and they were actually covered with pollinators even on the driveway before they went in the ground. It was pretty marvelous. So this was getting towards June, end of June, so it was getting hotter. You can see the lawn pathway coming down the side. And here's just another look at the bank of what we ended up doing with lots of sedges. Here's some Liatris spicata. That's all of this is holding this this slope together. So here's the Carex amphibola strip at the bottom. You can see the monadas in there. It's all moving in, and then we get up onto the top. This is the active drain field up here. So this is where we didn't want to put anything woody. Here's our little seating area, and now there wasn't really anything going on before, and now I think it's a space that you really want to be in. And here's another look at, here's another look at through the house. So already these things had only just gone in, and we were already seeing pollinators on them after they went in the ground too. So this coming year, this landscape will start to mature really pretty quickly. And here is just one final look at, if I can make it do it. This is the stream. This is what the stream looks like coming down the hill in the end. So from our site analysis, we know there's a slope. How are we going to use it? Let's put a stream going down it. So this just recirculates, starts at the top and comes down, and it's got quiet areas of water at the side as well that pollinators are able to use. So that is it from me. Here is our email address that I put up so you can see that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Alex. That was very inspiring and a lot of beauty right there. We don't have much time for questions, but we do have, I think, another 4 minutes before we'll be returning to the main room. I don't see any questions in the chat unless I'm missing it. Okay, wait a minute. Here's a question. Is it possible to design to deter mosquitoes? Asian tiger mosquitoes keep me inside more than I like.
Ah, me too. I'm also a delicious person, so it's our curse. So eliminating standing water is absolutely one of the things. So looking at your soil and getting drainage going as much as you can. So that's the adding of organic matter is something that can actually just be laid out on the top of your beds. Before your mulch, your shredded bark mulch, if it's there, will eventually become organic matter. But as that breaks down through freeze and thaw cycles, that will increase drainage. You can even do vertical mulching to help that, where a hole is literally drilled and then filled with mulch. Maybe you're punching through a layer of marine clay. So the elimination of standing water, I think, it's alleged that mint plants, so we could use, including our native mints, are not attractive to them. I've never found that to be the case, but some people do report that that's helpful. I will also be here for the open question session too, as well.
Yeah. Were sprinklers a factor in this design?
So there's no irrigation system that's been installed, and when this system is mature, it will not need to be irrigated unless there's some extraordinary drought event over the summer. So it was watered as it got established. That's the critical thing. But we do not recommend irrigation systems for our designs once they're established.
Yeah, it's a right plant in the right place. Okay, you work with what you have. What will you do about cicadas in this yard?
When the cicadas come, yes, in a few months. So most of these things should be large enough and have established root systems that if they get nibbled, they should survive. Kind of this unusual event that we're about to have that's sort of a little bit biblical, especially on top of everything else that we've experienced. So things might well get nibbled. They should be resilient enough at this point that the root systems will withstand it.
Yes. Somebody says, I noticed mulch in the final products. What type mulch is best for eco services?
So this mulch is put down just after planting because we want to avoid bare soil because our plants have not got to their final size yet. So for that first season, the contractors usually put down just a shredded bark mulch. It's not dyed in any way. And eventually it will just be incorporated as organic matter into the soil as it breaks down. But we don't want people to have to then repeat doing that. The idea is we've got this green mulch instead, long term.
Yes. Do you have any problem with the plants flopping into the lawn area as they grow?
So it's designed that it should be like the short kids at the front next to the pathway, like taller kids at the back. But if that is a problem, there are maintenance steps that you can take. So around the end of May, you can actually be surprisingly brutal with a lot of plants. Some of them you can encourage them to flower again. Some of them you do, and it's called the Chelsea chop because it was developed in time for Chelsea so that your plants would be happening and flowering just when you wanted. But you're going to take off a lot of the tall growth so that you should get stubbier plants that are kind of stronger looking. So that's definitely a technique that you can use. Some of these got staked last year once they were put in just because they were so small from the pots and the plants had got really tall.
Mm-hmm. Last question, what to do with exposed tree roots? We have 1 minute left.
So you're going to have to work around them. Like red maples are a classic that they'll have exposed roots everywhere and they'll be extremely difficult to work around. So planting with smaller plants around them, because you'll see that happening in nature in the forest, you can plant, you're just going to start with maybe a plug size around them. And then you'll start to build up a base of sedges, for example, around the base of your tree. So your tree roots will not be so exposed anymore.
Okay. Well, again, we thank you, Alex, and everyone. Alex will be sticking around for this ending session where we'll have some more questions. And there we are. Here we are.
Thank you very much.